How you doing? Thanks for having me again. I appreciate it. So, one of the things I really enjoy is alternate history. I enjoy seeing what would have happened with incentive structures and what would have happened with possibilities if something played out, right? So, some some alternate histories are more realistic than others because all it takes is a small choice here, a small choice there, and things could have ended up differently, right? So, for example, if the Japanese had not bombed Pearl Harbor and they decided to go with a different strategy and just go around the Philippines and the other American holdings in the Pacific and just grab the parts that were held by the Europeans who had been conquered by the Germans, World War II would have been completely different, right? It would have all played out differently. The entire second half of the 20th century would have been different, and what we live in now would likely be very different. Um, and so that's like a real possibility, right? So, but then there's other possibilities, like what if, I don't know, what if the Tokugawa shogunate had decided to invade North America, right? Like there's the number of things that would have to change historically to make that happen are so vastly different. It's ridiculous. Okay. Um, so there's that as an alternate history. Okay. So I have been thinking about Napoleon and the French and everything, and the French revolutionary experiment. And my thought is that what if instead of going imperial, Napoleon went European? Instead of saying, "Oh, I am the emperor of the French," he said, "Nope, I'm going to create a republic of Europe, and I am going to be first consul of Europe." Right? By staying first consul, he continues to maintain that power of being the hegemon, being the individual with all the power, with the juice, the ability to control things. But he keeps the PR shield of it being Republican, and he can keep that revolutionary energy that he was using before. But he could also truncate it so it's not as overpowering to delete all of the nobles throughout Europe, right? I mean, France was wiped clean, more or less, right? France had been overturned, had been changed into a very Republican state by removing the aristocracy. It was chaos, but it was what it was. So if you had created instead a assembly, European assembly, right? So instead of national assembly, something like a continental assembly or grand assembly. Let's just keep going grand because he likes the term grander, and grand was very useful, right, for his grand army. Um, and then an upper body called like a grand senate, and then something else. And he was first consul of Europe at that point, right? He would be able to extend his power and continue his rulership of Europe, but it would also allow him to be able to tap into the manpower which was available from all of these other European countries. So he would be able to turn all of these European commoners into members of this grand army that he had, but it was be based off of Europe, and it would allow him to locally, regionally dominate each. So if he was first consul of Europe, he could go ahead and make Europe the country, and it would create the incentive structure for local elites to want to participate, because if they have a seat in either the Grand Assembly or in the Grand Senate, then they have the ability to go ahead and gain more power for themselves and screw over that guy next to them in order to get their power and their property, etc. And he didn't have any issues with that, so there'd be no issue with doing that. The thing you need to remember is that the when humans do things, there might be high ideals and there might be this idea of going all the way, but the fact of the matter is we don't. Most of the time we get halfway there and it's close enough, it's good enough, and that's why progress takes so long, because everybody just keeps doing half measures, because not only is there a willingness to compromise after a period of time because people get tired, but also pushback by people who don't want to change things. So if the Napoleon, as first consul, was able to build and an infrastructure which supported his grand European army, then he would be able to go ahead and support that with the Grand Assembly and the Grand Senate, which he himself would preside over, even if it sat in France, just as he was ruling France as first consul of France too. And most countries often double dip titles, so it's not really a concern for him to rule both France and Europe at the same time. So one of the things that happened in real life when Napoleon was conquering places, is that he would roll in and then he would replace the monarch with someone for himself. So he had a brother who ended up becoming king of the Italians, and he had another brother, a half brother, I think it was, or step brother, or brother-in-law, or something, who became the king of the Spanish. So he used the pretense of needing to move troops through Spain in order to take out Portugal, because Portugal was a British ally, and he couldn't conquer Britain because you can't cross that channel, right? The Normandy invasion, there was no way he could do it opposite Normandy, right? There was no way that he could do what William the Conqueror did. There was no way he could do what they did on D-Day. It just wasn't possible. So he didn't have the naval strength. The English had the naval strength. They could stop that kind of thing. They couldn't invade, but they could stop an invasion from happening. So the French had replaced the Spanish monarchy, and they had put their own person in there. So Napoleon had a loyalist now on the Spanish throne. Now, in the Spanish colonies, they didn't go ahead and just accept this. They didn't want to be ruled by France. They didn't want to be ruled by this French guy who wasn't Spanish. So they decided that they were going to revolt, and they were going to rule in the king's name until he was restored. And what often happens is a coalition ends up becoming the dominant government. So all of these countries ended up being ruled by juntas. And these councils, these coalition juntas, these councils, ended up ruling the entirety of Latin America during the period in which the Spanish crown was held by a non-local or a non-Spaniard, or someone without the legitimacy, right? Because we discussed in the previous video about how the French-related dynasty replaced a Austrian-related dynasty. So it's really about legitimacy games, not so much whether or not you're actually Spanish or Austrian or French or whatever. It's about whether or not people believe, right? Which is the underground pinning of all of this. Everything. It's about whether people believe. But there needs to be incentive structures for people to believe. There needs to be a reason for people to believe. So anyway, so Napoleon couldn't control the Spanish colonies. That's why he sold Louisiana to the United States, is because there was no way for him to be able to send forces over there in order to control Louisiana territory from the British. So rather than have it fall to the British, he sold it to the Americans, which is the key piece that helped America become America. So one way or other, the Spanish, the colonies throughout the America, set up these juntas, and that's what they were ruled by. But when he conquered Portugal, the Portuguese crown escaped to Brazil, and they set up the Empire of Brazil. So they ruled from Brazil as the empire. So when Napoleon fell, the Spanish monarchy was restored, the Portuguese monarchy moved back to Lisbon, and they proceeded to rule as they did before, involved with European politics, etc. But all these colonies had had a taste of freedom by this point, and the United States had done what it did, and the French Revolution had done what it did. So all of these places in Spain started to go ahead and be like, hey, we want more freedom. And the Spanish monarchy was like, no. And then the Brazilian people were like, hey, we want more freedom. And the Portuguese monarch was like, no. And so if they had compromised, they could have been members of the same sort of territory for much longer, but the center never wants to give up power. And so they will short their future selves in order to go ahead and benefit their quarterly profit. Well, I'm sorry, short-term goals. So, seeing how that's the case, continuing with our alternate history, let's say Napoleon is able to stabilize Europe by creating this European republic, by going ahead and incentivizing the local nobles in order to buy in by participation in the National Assembly, or the Grand Assembly rather, and a Grand Senate. I'm thinking for the Grand Senate, the way that he would probably do it would be appointees by the consuls that would go through some sort of approval process that he would have a finger on, so it would be whoever he chose. And this would create an incentive for the local nobility and burghers and other bourgeois in order to go ahead and appease Napoleon, because they would have an actual seat in the government at that point to be able to debate, choose policy, go ahead and impact taxes, all that good stuff. Meanwhile, a much broader number of people would sit in the assembly, and so therefore a local in northern Portugal, a local count or whatever, would be able to go ahead and sell out his neighbor in order to appease Napoleon, potentially get into the Senate, and therefore have a reason to support Napoleon in this European Republic project that he doesn't really agree with, because it benefits him and benefits his children, and therefore hurting the chance of the Portuguese throne, the Portuguese royal family, of being able to come back, right? So let's say he does this, okay? This is the argument. So if he does this, and Napoleon doesn't invade Russia the way that he did in order to teach the emperor a lesson, and instead goes ahead and takes Crimea or takes parts of Ukraine in order to show the Russian emperor that he can't just do whatever he wants rather than burning down Moscow, then it creates a long enough stability that potentially the European Republic could become a thing, especially if Napoleon, loving to conquer stuff, decided to turn south, went to war against the Arabs, went to war against the Turks in the Eastern Mediterranean, and fought the British in those areas as well, because the British would still want to stop him. So if he manages to not have it collapse, because if it collapses, things continue like they do, right? With a different fundamental myth, which would have impacted 1848 differently, but let's just put that aside for the moment. If he had done that, then what it would have done is it would have caused a solid incentive for the Brazilian monarchy, now the former Portuguese monarchy, now the new Brazilian imperial monarchy, to really lean in to becoming an imperial power. Because at this point, they have a lot of the same stuff going for them that the United States had. It's just a different structure. I mean, they're Catholic, they are a monarchy, right? And they have the same sort of economy in a lot of ways that the American South did, with slavery and plantations, but not with cotton, with other stuff. And so, and they would be therefore also have this huge manifest destiny potential with the entire Amazonian plain. They'd have some weaker neighbors they could fight with, just like the United States did. And that would all incentivize this, Portuguese Empire 2.0, even though it would be a Brazilian empire, right? And it would give the second opportunity, the second breath. When the British lost the United States, those colonies, it really changed the dynamics and the way that the British did their empire, right? Because now they leaned more into India and Africa as places in order to extract wealth and power, because they didn't have a North American base anymore. And so being cut off from their home country, the traditional ancestral lands, it would cause the Portuguese dynasty to really lean into this. They could become a secondary, or an alternative rather, destination point for immigrants from Europe. So all of these immigrants that are coming from Europe would leave potentially and not go to the WASP-controlled United States, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant-controlled United States, but rather go down south where it's more Catholic friendly. It's already they already have a deep relationship, and so they might end up with more of the Southern European immigration, such as from Italy and from Spain and Portugal, while the United States gets more of the Northern European feed, Northern Germans, the Scandinavians, the English, right? French immigrants going either to Quebec, which would probably not as strong an incentive at this point, but even though they speak French, going down to Brazil instead, and the same deal for the Southern Germans at that point, because all of them would have an incentive to go this place where their faith is the main thing. So with this in mind, Brazil becomes a second hub in the Western world. So the United States historically has this deep advantage of being one of the most stable and strongest and most growth-centric nations that exist in the New World. They push westward because of the open territory, their strong immigration policies, and the fact that the North is calm under the British. It's not being as expansionist as the United States. And Mexico is to the south, and it's weak because of its own internal chaos, because of its lack of controls, etc., that didn't exist with the United States. In the United States, the elites were bought into the system, and the people coming here had a big American dream, and they could show up and they could expand westward, and they could get their own plot of land, they could be the king of their own castle, etc., etc., etc. And so if the Brazilians are offering that sort of same thing, then it changes the dynamic greatly. And just like anything, it says knock-on effects, right? So if we end up with a world by 1830 with a stable European republic where France is the dominant power, and then they control the majority of the Mediterranean, so it's like a second Rome, right? Everybody wants one of those. And they're expanding that way, trying to build a navy which is rival to the British, so that way they can expand in a different way. The British continuing to lean on their other colonies, leaning into not only the India, which they were able to take effectively from the other ones, but if the European powers fall and they show that they're becoming loyal, then it's likely that the British would go ahead and take advantage of the same sort of thing where they try to incentivize elite powers, right? So the Dutch already ruled parts of Indonesia, and so Indonesia might fall under the British at this point because they see it as an easy opportunity, and the Dutch are trying to participate in this new European project, so they don't have the energy to go ahead and defend their colony per se. And then the same deal for the Philippines, right? The Philippines was Spanish, but without Spain being a counterweight that actually existed, it would make sense that the British would want to take away those bases from the Spanish. So we could end up with a very different, very ironically larger British Empire, as though ruling a quarter of the world in real life wasn't enough for them. But then we end up with that British Empire. We end up with that European Republic that we were talking about. We end up with the United States, which is continuing to do what it does, right? And then we end up with the Brazilian Empire, which may be trying to cross the Andes in order to conquer Bolivia, but Peru, to southward into the Andes and just southward in general, and to conquer Bolivia, and then pushing up into where the French and the British and the Dutch have territories to the north of Brazil, and then building their own fleet in order to continue to hold their own colonies that they already had in Africa, in Angola and Mozambique, right? And so by pushing there, then they strengthen themselves. So by the 1830s, by the 1850s, the United States could look similar. We have the French Empire pushing south. We have the British and the French still duking it out all the time. But we also have now this huge board, this new player potentially on the board of the Brazilian Empire. Now, if industrialization plays out more or less the same, with the British being able to go ahead and industrialize the way that they did, with the French now, but Europe would play out a little differently because now there's a central incentivization, but also a deeper confederation across the thing, so a better standard. So maybe Europe would be stronger industrially, perhaps. In the United States, playing out more or less the same, and then Brazil in the mix, trying to industrialize as well. So we get to the point where the U.S. Civil War takes place. So the U.S. Civil War was this conflict between the North and the South, where the North was industrial and the South was agricultural, and the abolitionist movement and slavery in the United States had reached a fever pitch, right? And it already caused much violence for decades, right? Almost since the inception of the United States, it had been causing violence domestically. But it got to a breaking point where Abraham Lincoln was elected. And so imagining that still took place. And then it caused a split where the southern states said, we're going to leave, we're going to keep slavery, you're out. We're out. And so in real life, this split, the Confederacy was looking for support internationally because the North had better guns, they had better industry, and they could beat the South on that front. They also had more population. And so the South, ironically, ended up arming slaves at some point in order to fight the North. So in real life, the South couldn't find support in order to go ahead and fight the British, or fight the North rather. The South couldn't find support in order to fight the North because they had slavery. And the British had outlawed slavery already. The French had outlawed slavery already. So if this European Republic existed, they wouldn't have been able to do the whole slavery thing, most likely. And the British would have still gone the non-slavery route because there's no incentives to change that. But Brazil probably would still have slavery. It didn't end slavery in Brazil until like 1888, I believe. And so there'd be no reason for it to not have slavery, even with industrialization taking place. So the South is in a different position now. Now the South has the ability to get aid from this rival of the United States, from Brazil, the Brazilian Empire, which was competing with it in the same hemisphere. So if the Brazilians start giving open and clear money and power, or money and weapons, to the South, as well as potentially troops in order to fight against them, then it makes sense that the British would likely tag on with the Union, because there's no way that they'd want their long border between the United States and Canada being attacked by the Union. So they would most likely support the Union even more outright than they did in real life. And the European Republic, unable to support the South because of the slavery thing, but not wanting to be on the same side as the British, would probably give money to both sides and guns, because if the U.S. loses, everybody wins. And if the Brazilians lose, the French win, the Europeans win. And if the British lose, then the Europeans win. So if everybody loses, the Europeans win. So they would probably arm everybody. Under the table, of course. Okay, so now how this war turns out, there's a number of different ways. I mean, if the Brazilians literally put troops on the ground in the Confederacy to fight against the North, and if the British put troops on the ground in the United States to fight the South, this changes America's myth very deeply. America has this myth about us doing it all alone. Like, we did it ourselves. Like, we're the ones who won that war. We're the ones who fought it. We won World War II. We won World War I. Like, that's the story we tell. But if in the mid-19th century, European powers and Brazil have troops on the ground in the United States, then it fundamentally changes the story of how America views itself. So not only do we have a change in the entire cultural narrative of the United States, but regardless of who wins, there's a deeper tie into the other powers. And if both the British and the Brazilians start getting involved and their troops actually clash on American soil, it's very likely that the United States or the Brazilians and the British would war other places. So they would fight in the Caribbean. There would be no Americans involved. They would just be killing, Brazilians be killing British be killing Brazilians. And in Africa, they could easily spill out from where the British control in Africa, where the Brazilians control in Africa. And next thing you know, you have conflict there. And the Europeans wouldn't just sit by. Anything in order to give the bloody nose to their rivals, they would do that. So it's highly likely that the Europeans, despite not being on the same side as the Confederacy and the Brazilians, would end up fighting the British wherever they could. So there would be conflict all over the place. And this is likely another world war that may actually be called a world war, as opposed to all the world wars that happen in real life that were called world wars until World War I. So, but after this, because of the number of things that are in play, the incentive structure for future stuff changes so dramatically that it would be hard for me to plausibly predict. I've already put my finger on the scale some places in order to make things work, in order to get us to a point where Brazil became long-term imperial, where the European Republican project worked, where the British end up controlling those parts of the Pacific, where the United States does what it does. But all of those pieces have the incentives in place at the beginning of the 1800s for it to actually have played out like that. some of those things took place in certain ways that it wouldn't have been difficult for that scale to continue to tilt. The difficulty comes in is when we throw in this global war that comes out of the United States war, potentially, right? The United States Civil War. If that happens, it changes the entire game board. And by 1914, the world is so different that I could not tell you. World War I definitely wouldn't happen because all of the incentive structures that created World War I in the first place have already been removed by 1830 because of the long-running European Republic, right? There might be civil wars within the European Republic or wars of independence, but those would be very different than what happened with World War I. And therefore, World War II wouldn't happen because World War II is a very direct result of everything that happened with World War I. So it's important for me when I do these, when I run these in my head, because I do that for fun because I'm a crazy man, that I understand what would possibly happen. What's a realistic incentive structure that would lead to these things. And I think that's the lesson, the real takeaway there is to remember that incentive structures determine how the world works. What do you get out of it? Why do you get that out of it? That's the real question here. Like if you're making a decision today, the reason you make that decision is because of all of these pieces, the things outside of you, the things inside of you that make you make those decisions. And that's the same deal for everybody because we're all just human, right? But when we get to a scale of mass society, it's not just what I feel, it's what I feel with us. And it's what those external factors are doing to us. If for whatever reason it got to be really, really cold in 2027, like it was just ridiculously cold over the entire planet, that would change how things would be executed. Now, history might not remember it because it imagines that humans are independent actors from our environments and our ecologies, but the fact of the matter is that all those factors play into it. Well, I hope you got something to think about. Talk to you later.